Alright, so we are continuing with our discussion on Kakar's excerpt on sexuality from the book The Indians. So here, for instance, when we look at contemporary sexuality, there are there's a lot of critical debate on why is it that Indians went from being so sexually open to being so sexually repressed in modern times. And of course, there are a lot of reasons given for it, which smack of a great deal of bias, political as well as religious. So, for instance, one of the reasons given is that, it has to do with the Islamic rule in India, because Islam is, sexually repressive, and as a result, we became sexually repressive as well. Not correct, because in fact there are commentaries on the Quran, the hadiths, which do talk about the satisfaction of the sexual instinct, right? Of course, for the male, the privileged male, not for anybody else, but there is that understanding. In fact, Perfume Garden as well is a West Asian text, and it does sort of explore it, much like the Kama Sutra. It's a sexual treatise, so not quite accurate. Similarly, the other reading given is that, it has to do with British colonial rule, Victorian prudery. It's so problematic, and that's the reason we've become like this. We were really different, and no. In fact, what the Victorian prudery did to us is that it made us embarrassed of our openness of the erotic in our culture, but it didn't in that sense change our attitudes towards sexuality. To actually understand that, you have to come back to India itself and to a certain Indian way of looking at things, because if the erotic is seen as significant and important, so is asceticism. Like eroticism, asceticism is also held in great esteem, and so you can't kind of say that, it is purely because of any external influence. It is who we are culturally, right? Because the ascetic ideal too, in Kakar's words, is then quintessentially Indian, perennially in competition with the erotic one for possession of the Indian soul. And this is the contradictory nature of being Indian, or of India itself, that what is true of India is also not true of India. So if eroticism is true of India, so is asceticism. And both will then compete for an equal position, right? Because much of the reason for the ascetic ideal also comes from this concept of the rapacious Indian woman who has untamed sexual desires, and she will somehow drain the man of his energy. In fact, in the section on sexuality and health, he explores that further, because Ayurveda also talks about the idea how semen is supposed to be, let me tell you the actual words, the manifestation of the, of the soul. What do women have then? I don't know. Okay, but it's an odd way of looking at it, but it's a very, very strong, very persistent belief system that if the semen is released in an act of sexual, in a sexual act, then it is just in its gross physical form. But if it moves upwards, and it sort of goes through this whole spiritual, processing, it becomes ojas. And ojas is literally the foundation of, spirituality according to Ayurveda as well, because semen is seen as the material form of the soul, and so when it is processed and brought into the form of ojas, it's the highest thing any person could do, which is why much of the stories of the ascetics in our Indian text have to do with the ascetic trying so desperately to do their tapas while being tempted. and they are, trying to ignore it. Sometimes they don't, and they sort of falter and give in, but that's the point, that they have to resist it, and then they will reach spiritual enlightenment. So that's a viewpoint. In fact, as mentioned, the belief in the possibility of sublimating sexuality into spirituality is something that a lot of Hindus believe in. So it's a belief system. And so in that sense, you can understand why, while the erotic is important, so is the ascetic. Both are, vying for attention. And there is, in that sense, different ways in which it's practice. Some people believe renounce it completely, or you have the tantric viewpoint of divorce the sexual act from any kind of pleasure, and that that release of energy will again form ojas in some sense. So there are different ways people understand it. The problem is that when you place celibacy on a pedestal, the toll that can take on a society could be quite a lot, because you are then constantly warring within yourself, right? You're wondering, oh, this is who I'm supposed to be. I don't conform to it. Am I not a good enough person, right? And so it's in that sense a burden that you sort of carry. And the idea that the loss of semen could mean a loss of your soul, a loss of your energy, is in fact actually it's a disease, a psychological disease unique to the South Asian population. In fact, he calls it swapna dosha. A lot of men, when they wake up, having lost semen during nocturnal emissions, they just assume that, they have been drained of energy, and they, talk of feeling a certain kind of loss, a certain sense of, unable to do anything because everything's sort of been taken away from them. So you realize that this is a psychological impact of such a viewpoint. So it can be, in that sense, quite problematic, right? And so we are also, as a culture, people who place a lot of checks on our body, on our mind, especially with regard to sexuality. So even if you look at the idea of virginity itself, right, young men will talk about how many sexual conquests they've had, and young women will talk about how they've never had anything. And this may not have anything to do with their actual sexual experience, like men could be boasting and overstating it, and women could be understating it, because if you're found having somebody, that could damage your social reputation, right? So chastity continues to be a demand for the woman, but not for the man, right? Men are not necessarily expected to be chaste, right? Of course, you're wondering if the women are underreporting and the men are overreporting it. Who are the men sleeping with? That's a whole different conversation. We're looking at maybe older women. We're looking at probably soliciting women. So there's a lot of other ways in which it happens. And sometimes, of course, these actual young women who choose not to reveal what they're really doing, because it's a social stigma that you might not be able to recover from. So in many ways, that kind of a check also works as a way to control your sexuality. So for a lot of women, then what ends up happening is you're underreporting it, yes, because culturally you're not supposed to admit that you are having sex, but you're also, in that sense, carrying a certain burden of how you should feel about your body. So a lot of women, in fact, report feeling shame as far as their body is concerned, shame as far as their sexual identity is concerned. There is a sense that I should not, be acquainted with my body. I should feel uncomfortable about it. I should feel dissociated with it, right? A lot of women don't have names for their genitals. They don't actually know how it looks. They have not actually tried to understand and explore their body. They've never spoken to even doctors about it, because there is a sense of shame, discomfort, a sense of feeling shy about it, and so that too takes a toll on you. And so even if you do have a sexual experience, and sometimes not even out of choice, another reason why that trauma does not get accessed is because you are told not to talk about it. And that's so firmly entrenched, you continue to carry a burden of guilt about your body because of those viewpoints. And that is kind of like a bit of a problem. So that anxiety is something that carries right through for a lot of women, which is why you find a lot of women unable to express themselves sexually even after marriage. And that's a very unfortunate thing, because there are many reasons for it. One is, of course, your own personal anxiety that you carry about your body. The other is the fact that you are also being told culturally that women who express themselves sexually, um, openly express themselves sexually, are bad women, right? And women are dangerous because women will drain you out, right? So you're constantly being told this, because the men around you are being told this, the men around you believe this. So that's also a check on your behavior. So there are these social and cultural limitations of your sexual expression and desire that dampens your access to pleasure in even marriage, right? And so every time you were to sort of voice a desire, you are either confronted with the, oh, she's going to drain me out and she's going to ruin me, or you're confronted with, oh, how does she know this? Oh, so she's had experiences before. Oh, and that leads to a certain sexual jealousy and paranoia, which leads to abuse and violence, and that devolves into a whole different kind of hell. But that's the kind of spaces that unfortunately a woman gets trapped by. So in fact, for a lot of Indian women, and that's probably one of the most damaging things that the book talks about, as the segment especially talks about, is the idea that for majority of Indian women, pleasure in sex is not even a concept. They have never heard of it, they don't understand it. Which is why even if you look at the movie Parched, what's very interesting is there are these three women, they come from three different spaces. One of them has for the first time had particularly enlightened sexual experience, and she comes back and tells the other two that I've had this and it was so pleasurable, and the other two scoff at her because they're like, no, sex does not mean pleasure, it means pain, it means agony. In fact, the words used to describe it, which even Kakar talks about, is kaam and dhanda, work and business. There's something very transactional about it, right? But here in Parched, this woman says, no, it was so great. And so they're all like, that can actually happen? And so they're sort of suddenly grappling with a whole different idea of your physical reality, which you realize is both beautiful to see and also so distressing to note that that's the normal way of what sexual experiences mean for women. It is pain. There's no pleasure. That concept is so alien to them. And all of this is happening in a country like ours, where you do have a text like the Kama Sutra, which is saying that, there has to be an understanding of the sexual experience before you can sort of, for you to live well. And yet you have spaces where women don't have that access. And that's really sad. That's deeply problematic. So for a lot of women, when they don't get that access, they are in that sense forced to sublimate their energies in different spaces. And what you start to realize is that for a lot of women, that sublimation comes through being a mother. Now, when she's a mother, she can sublimate that energy, and she can, in that sense, bestow on her son all that unexpressed energy, which is unfortunate because that's an unnecessary burden to be placed on that child, which in many ways explains a certain equation of the mother-son, relationship in the Indian context that we don't find otherwise. In fact, Kakar says something really interesting about it. He, in fact, quotes E.K. Ramanujan, the folklorist and poet, who said, Indian men tend to repress their independence from their mothers, while in contrast, Western men tend to repress their dependence, right? And all of this comes from the fact that if a woman is a mother, she's a good person. right? Because she now doesn't have any insane sexual appetite. She has sublimated her energy. She's become a good person, because otherwise a woman is incapable of goodness. In fact, there are some really ghastly statements that are made here. Only when fire will cool, the moon burn, or the ocean fill with sweet water will a woman be pure. Wow. Or who can belittle women, women who bear children? It's basically, unless you're a mother, you have nothing good about you. Or a woman who shows more love for you than your mother is a slut. So, in case you were wondering why women in marriages don't have access to pleasure, that explains it all. But what ends up happening is that when the woman can't express herself in this way, she can't have access to romance, and she sort of loses a part of herself. And then she's sort of making do by, bestowing all that energy on her son. That burden on that child, in many ways, subconsciously carries another problematic burden, which is, my mother carries this much of affection, right? And she shows it to me because she's my mother. If she was not my mother, what would she be? So any woman you marry, unless she's a mother, unless she bears your children, you're always wary of her, because she then possesses a certain energy and a certain kind of emotional bandwidth that you are not comfortable with. So you are always going to sort of resist her. You're always going to sort of stay at a distance from her, because you don't completely trust her. You're like, oh no, something's off with her, because you know what? If she's not a mother, where is all that unchecked energy going? Right? Because then I can't trust her. So only if she's a mother, she's curtailed, she's conforming, and then it's okay. But if she's not a mother, I don't know if I can trust her. So you see, it becomes like a very, very problematic kind of scenario. In fact, it becomes a vicious cycle, because the woman is repressed sexually. She then becomes a mother. She sublimates that energy into her maternal affections, which then causes the son to feel wary of what a woman's energies are like. And so then he continues to carry that kind of a burden, projects that idea of what a woman is, and so on and so forth. That really problematic cycle continues. And you realize that it's not just from the men, but society in general, that you are being sort of given these frameworks, because and to quote from Kakar, the fate of a traditional Indian girl's sexuality is a socially enforced progressive renunciation of her erotic needs, because maternity often demands an even greater renunciation from the woman. So she's constantly asked to sort of cut herself off, repress herself, sublimate it into her maternal energy, and thus sort of make herself a presentable social figure. So it's a lot of intense burden to carry in yourself, right? And what you then start to realize is that everyone comes off feeling too sorry from this entire equation, because what ends up then happening is a lot of men sometimes, because they are so uncomfortable by their mother's excess affection, they also cut away from their wives. And because they are fearful of the mature woman, there is also this fascination with the young, nubile woman, the undeveloped girl, which is a disgusting fascination, but it exists. This fascination with the pre-adolescent, or the young adolescent woman, because she's not fully a woman, so she's okay. She's not a threat. She's not a threat to your masculinity. It makes for a very uncomfortable set of realizations about the society. But in many ways, it also sums up what contemporary perspectives on Indian sexuality look like?